Thank you, Lydia, and Busta and everyone that makes this summer school happen. It's truly great to be here and great to come after Anaïs that spoke this morning, as I will try not to repeat, but really build on what she shared. Let me say a little bit where TNI is coming from to start with. The Transnational Institute is an internationalist research advocacy organization based in Amsterdam. And we actually have been having our 50th anniversary. So our existence is in direct response to the coup by Pinochet in Chile in '73. And so this start of the neoliberal violent experiment that has been going on ever since is something that TNI has been exposing and providing alternatives to. So the alternative side of things is what I will speak to, next to diving a bit deeper in the political economy of the energy transition and where it goes wrong. So this public alternatives work that Lydia mentioned is started in 2000, 2005, when the water wars were going on at the beginning of this century in Cochabamba, Bolivia. And in that decade, we started investigating and supporting all these water justice struggles around the world, where movements, together with trade unions, often local authorities, kind of combined forces to kick out those water multinationals that didn't really care if people were, like getting the water to survive or simply dying. And this strategy of reclaiming public services then expanded in 2016, after we have identified already 235 cases of remunicipalized water, where local communities decided to do this better at more affordable rates, to organize the water system around water as a human right. And then we started to open up this investigation to continue our research on water, but also see how these sectors that are so centered to our collective flourishing, how this is happening in energy, but also in transport, education, telecommunication, and the list goes on and on. So by now, we have created this database, publicfutures.org, and it evidences over 1,700 cases of reclaimed and new public services. And the variety is huge, with over 120 forms of public services that are at stake. And it's very much about how ownership is crucial. It's not an end in itself, but it's crucial to go from there in order to have deep democratization of these core centers of the economy. So in order to democratize the service, we first need to reclaim it from the market. We need to dismantle those markets. And I will talk a bit more when it comes to energy in a bit. And so I think it's really important to understand these strategies as ways to roll back corporate power in order to build those social majorities around what we have in common, right? And what is very important is that we have been working from the beginning with trade unions. Organized labor is crucial to get us there. And I think as social movements, as energy and environmental movements, we have to build those bridges. Let me see if this works. So just to dive a little bit deeper, which is complementary to what was already shared this morning, we've been diving into these local reclaimed energy services. So in Hamburg, they remunicipalized the grid and set up a municipal energy company. There was also a citizen referendum and campaign that was really aiming for energy democracy. Again, the energy democracy dimensions did fall short. So as was shared already, it's this constant battle to push for more participation, for more democratic decision-making, and this is a continuous struggle. But it did also lead to lower bills, to more renewables, so we have to be acknowledging both the opportunities and I think the challenges. In Kauai Island, they actually kicked out the investor-owned utility and created a cooperative utility, which also had the same benefits. And I think it's also very interesting to see how to work with a more expansive notion of what we mean with public, with democratic governance, public ethos, accountability at its core, because otherwise public is so easily and very often co-opted by corporate and authoritarian forces. The last example is from Plymouth, which is, I think, quite interesting to spend a minute on, because the municipality created this community benefit organization, Plymouth Energy Community, PEC, and this was kind of initially driven by the municipality, but then 100 residents took over and created this autonomous organization that was supported by the municipality, but was working autonomously to start producing solar energy, where the rents of this solar park went to the disenfranchised community in Plymouth, as levels of energy poverty are huge in this area of the UK. And I think what is very interesting is that this public community partnership really helped to cancel debt for thousands of households in this municipality. And it really worked well to have a holistic view of just transition policy, to have the different departments in the municipality working together, to have this autonomous, equitable collaboration with a community organization. And I think there are lessons there that are not like limited to the local, but often they can work a bit more easily, even though still with challenges on the local level, but how then to learn from that and apply that across skills, let's say. We already heard a bit about how the electricity sector works, so I won't go into much detail, but just to say we've been focusing on the electricity sector because it's simply the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. 75% is what it's responsible for, and so we need full-fledged electrification. Solar and wind is what, of course, we need to move to completely. But if you look at this system, and this is the simplest image I could find for you, the energy, or the electricity sector more specifically, is immensely complex. This is really just the basics, right? So a utility, for example, which is what I will dive into a bit more, is what was originally responsible for generation, whether it's dirty energy or solar and wind, transmission, then the distribution to go from high voltage to low voltage, and then, of course, the retail that was already talked about. And then you have a system operator to make sure that the supply and demand is constantly meeting. And then, of course, then you need the storage and the energy efficiency measures to make sure we actually reduce our energy use and our energy generation. And all of that has, of course, still a very, like fossil fuel dependency to it. And then we have to ramp up those renewables. And for this to go simultaneously, you need coordination, you need planning. And when we don't have a system approach to this, it's not working, and it hasn't been working. And this report, Energy Transition or Energy Expansion, has been about exactly that. We haven't seen on the global level any energy transition whatsoever. This year, just some days ago, we heard new headlines that we have record emissions, more and more fossil fuel extraction. So there are many sides to this, but an important dimension in order to get everything right is to understand that all this needs to come together. All this needs to be put under accountable, public, democratic control to make it work. And that means, of course, building on those energy communities, making sure that a national, territory-wide system actually defends those energy communities. Because now, as I said, this is the simplest image of it. There are like numerous market measures that are interfering here, that are making it way more complicated than it already is to actually transition. We even have multiple markets competing against each other to make a profit in this mess. So I'll just move on. We already heard a bit about the European Union, and one of these reports was already featured. What I just want to kind of emphasize is that generation of renewables has been largely privatized across the European Union, maybe except for France, where EDF is doing a bit of that. And then I know EDF is also heavily corporatized, especially abroad. It's working like any other multinational. Then there has been, when it comes to EDF, actually a huge push from trade unions to democratize this utility. And so the fact is then that renewables are hugely volatile. At some moments of the day, you have an abundance, you have so much renewables, and then at other moments you have hardly any, right? And so private investors, they want a set stream of revenue. So that means that government subsidies have been paramount to get any renewables actually in the system. And this has come in the form of feed-in tariffs, in the form of power purchasing agreements, and it's basically really to secure the profits of private producers. And I do want to make a distinction here between those, again, those energy communities that are also relying on feed-in tariffs and those big companies that I will speak to later that are really hijacking the energy transition, that only care about profits and that really divest from the sector, you know, like when these aren't secured. Because of all this, the transition in Europe hasn't been going well. You hear all kinds of headlines, you know, the transition is inevitable, we have so much more renewables in the grid. But actually, it isn't going well, especially when you take into account our historic responsibilities, which are way, way more than the actual targets we now see. But then again, we can have more ambitious targets without the actual capacities to lead on a transition to make sure we hold our governments accountable. This isn't happening, right? So we have seen the EU in recent years striking deals with governments in Northern Africa and the Middle East to kind of jump on that green hydrogen potential, which is a big scam because it's all about extractivism. It's all about exporting those renewables to Europe. So basically, it's outsourcing the transition to these countries so that actually countries like Tunis, like Tunisia, they don't have any development. They don't have any renewables for themselves. So this is a huge problem. And my colleague Hamza Mouchene has been, together with Katie Sandwell, also a colleague, has been putting together all these different struggles in Northern Africa and the Middle East around dismantling green colonialism. And I just want to give one example of how this actually works because it's so striking and I think it's quite outrageous. We haven't more resistance in Europe against this. So the example and issue is that in Tunis, the German Development Agency, GIZ, they set up shop in the Tunisian government, in the actual office of the Tunis government, to co-write renewable energy policy, to make sure it benefits those German, those European multinationals, instead of the Tunisian people. And this is why kind of this electricity and gas company, you know, utility in Tunisia has been fighting renewable policy because it's going at the expense of their own domestic development. And we have to support those struggles instead of seeing them as against renewables. They want renewables, but not at their own expense, obviously. So a little bit more about the public power dossier we have been building. This Green Multinationals report has been core to it. So we pulled a number of researchers from ODG in Catalonia, from Multinational Observatory in Paris, from CorpWatch, who's from Japan to UK, all over the place. So altogether, we kind of zoomed in on 15 of the world's biggest, quote-unquote, green multinationals to really unpack their business models, to see what they're doing in talk and in practice, and how that actually is completely the opposite, right? So basically, between 2016 and 2022, these 15 companies have accumulated a profit of over 175 billion US dollars. To put this in perspective, this is more than 7 times the actual climate finance that has been going on from the north to the so-called south. And it's, again, in all these cases, very clear that these companies only invest in renewables when their profits are secured. They're often still those, you know, like fossil fuel companies, you know, like still benefiting from the fossil fuel industry. Let me have a look. So basically, we have to grapple with the fact as environmental, as climate justice movements, that they are not interested in decarbonization. Financial returns is their core business, and as such, they are derailing hijacking the energy transition, and blocking climate policies that hamper their profits. And those are the exact climate policies we need, right? So let's now go into kind of the economics of the energy transition and seeing kind of the underlying policy myths that are still dominating today's discourse. This is just a quick overview. The first is on the private sector. So the private sector, in nearly all media articles, in all statements by public officials, by industry officials, you'll hear that the private sector is leading the transition, and it's going great. It's going, you know, like it's a done deal. It's inevitable. But actually, when you look at the figures, so first of all, as I said before, the energy mix is expanding. It's not transitioning. So, and this is, of course, because the private sector, they care about sales, and whether it's dirty energy, whether it's clean energy. And that's how we've seen more emissions and more climate breakdown. And then when you look deeper, you actually see that 60% of all climate finance is actually coming from governments and households. And again, I'm putting these in the same category as researchers have been doing, because we have to work together against these transnational corporations to make the energy transition work. And what's kind of very important to highlight here is that these big private sector actors, they prioritize themselves, and they prioritize big other multinationals. So, for example, these public-public partnerships between Iberdrola and Amazon, we are seeing more and more of those type of forces colliding at the expense of an actual, you know, like system change. So, you know, this is kind of to explain the discrepancy between all these nice billboards, how, you know, like these companies are going green, but when the system is not going green, it means nothing, right? It means more extractivism. And also the fact that these 15 companies, and it's just an example because there are so many more, they are muscling out small renewable initiatives. They are muscling out those energy communities. They're absorbing them, as we already heard this morning, and they're undermining legislation for community energy. So this is, I think, something we have to reckon with. And then I think we need to make a distinction between public finance and public ownership. So we hear more and more that there's, you know, sufficient public finance going around for the transition. And yes, that's true. You know, like we have monetary powers when it comes to the European Bank, when it comes to the US Bank, you know, like these big countries that have monetary sovereignty. There is enough money going around, and they, of course, should take the responsibility to finance unconditionally climate action in global South countries. But matter of fact is that our discourse has been growing where public finance has been used for private profits. And this is called blended finance. Of course, every few years you hear a new catchy name, and blended finance, you know, what does it mean? It means public governments, public authorities are de-risking the private sector, right? And I know de-risking was already discussed on the first day by Kai, so I won't dive into this much more, but just to say, every year the investment deficit for a green transition is growing massively because the climate crisis is, you know, like getting bigger and bigger. And in order to actually do something about it, we have to go beyond this public finance discourse and actually see how public finance needs to be directly invested to have public ownership and operation of renewables, and also, of course, of the energy efficiency measures, of the conservation measures that are needed. Because, yeah, just this figure, which just shows this imbalance that I want to highlight, and then I move on, is for every $1 in private finance, in terms of private sector finance for the climate crisis, it takes $4 in public funds. So, I mean, this is outrageous. Just think of it. How much this is draining public pockets. And this is actually the mechanism everybody believes in. And this is the mechanism that at the core of these JETPs, these Just Energy Transition Partnerships that are the new green new green, let me say now I'm kind of losing my train of thought, but structural adjustment, green structural adjustment. We know it from the past, you know, and this is happening now through these just energy transition partnerships, and it's meaning more debt for low-income countries. And it's meaning, you know, a lot of public funds that actually should be invested directly in the transition. And I know, of course, this doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't even happen in 1 or 5 years, right? To build this full-fledged public democratic energy system across countries. But we need to make sure that when we buy from the private sector those technologies, that actually this then, you know, like it's over time turning into public capacity, that we take that in-house, that we kind of crowd out the private sector to make sure that, you know, like public sector workers know how to build those wind turbines, build those solar panels, you know, build that long-term storage that we desperately need. And so direct public procurement is key to make that happen, to have that intermediate measure towards building a system on national levels and on local levels that, of course, have to articulate together. The second myth is about free markets. So free markets, you know, like, is another word for the liberalization we've been seeing across the European Union and in many, many other places. And basically, free markets have been resulting in oligopolies. So in Europe, for example, the number of big electricity producers halved from 10 to 5 in previous years. And this development, these market mechanisms have been responsible for hikes in energy poverty, in job cuts across the European Union. We have figures for that. Also in higher costs for authorities, and a lack of investments that are and have been so desperately needed. So these market approaches go very much together with financialization. And actually, the dynamic here is that of the 15 quote-unquote green multinationals we investigated, 12 of these 15 were controlled by Vanguard, one of the biggest investment funds. BlackRock also played a major role, but we saw actually, as this research took about 2 years to conduct, that they just stepped in and out, just invested and divested, depending on the profitability of renewables. So then you see how reliable these type of actors are. And this financialization that comes with, you know, liberalization and free market mechanisms, it just makes the energy transition so much more complicated, which, yeah, in no way is helping us. The third dimension, which is, you know, the economics of the transition, is that we have been focusing on the price. So we've been hearing, you know, renewables are getting so cheap, the falling price will just, you know, magically trickle down into a transition. And actually, if you want to dive real deep into this dimension, because I think we really have to grapple with it to make better energy policies. The book, The Price is Wrong by Brad Christophers is amazing in this regard. And basically, what we see happening is that when prices drop, when prices drop for renewables, the private renewable producers see their profit margins go down as well. So lower prices means lower returns, means they actually, you know, an abundance of renewable energy is not necessarily in their interest. And we actually see that, for example, some suppliers are withholding their renewable energy sales because prices are too low. And this is with the kind of capitalist newspeak of oversupply. There's an oversupply because you can't make enough profit. And so the prices paradigm actually also, you know, like takes us away from the fact that we have to invest in these efficiency measures. We have to degrow the energy system. And we cannot do that when we are just relying on prices. And the final thing that I think is really important here is that it really takes attention away from the system costs. So the price argument, and yeah, I'm spending a bit more time here because it's the price of kilowatt hour. It's not the system cost. It's not the cost to connect renewables to the grid. It's not the cost to build the storage needed to actually use those renewables. And so the system cost, according to some research, is actually 7 times higher. And of course, we should pay that cost, right? There's no question about it. Cost and price shouldn't be the factor if we're transitioning or not. But I think, yeah, it's quite misleading to focus on price, and we should burst that myth in our analysis. So let me go to the next one, which these final 2 myth busters are about international property law. One dimension is intellectual property rights, so patents and so on. And of course, these companies like Tesla, like Ørsted, all these transition technology producers, they are pretending, you know, like they are key. They should get all the benefits to make a transition happen. But actually, through these patents that these companies hold, it takes on average 24 years for innovations to reach the mass market. 24 years, that means, you know, we will be beyond or close to 2050 for the very necessary new innovations to actually, you know, like be used in society. And much of the research and development actually hasn't been originating in the private sector. And Mariana Mazzucato has done great research to actually show that, that the innovation has been coming from public, state-owned bodies, like, of course, universities and so on. Then the other dimension of international property law is investment protection. This mechanism is part of free trade agreements that are bound by international law. And investment protection is another word for investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS. We know ISDS from trade agreements between the EU, the US, TTIP, EU, Canada, CETA, and more recently there has been a huge successful campaign around the Energy Charter Treaty. This is actually the biggest investment agreement worldwide, and it's still expanding across Asian, across African countries, but through all this campaigning, the European Union and its member states actually officially withdrew from the Energy Charter Treaty, which means that under this treaty at least, governments can no longer be sued by these foreign investors, by these transnational corporations. And this is key because just threatening with a claim has been sufficient for governments to put their renewable, to put their transition regulation and policies in the freezer, to put them in the fridge, and to kind of like say, okay, you know, like if we get a claim of $100 million or billions of dollars, you know, yeah, we can't afford that. So this really needs to be tackled, and actually this battle needs to be won across all free trade agreements worldwide. And so now let me kind of quickly go to what, let's say, if not the private sector, if not free markets, then what, right? And this is about owning the means of production, owning the means of distribution, that was already mentioned this morning. So, so basically, let me see here. So basically, we need to understand that the utilities are the backbone of your electricity system if we recognize that full-fledged electrification is what we need. But to make sure that these utilities are actually transformed from the corporatized, if not privatized entities that there are now, to become truly accountable, we need massive social struggle. This is the biggest social struggle that we should be aiming at for the years, for the decades to come. Because otherwise we will never be able to rein in corporate power, and we'll never be able to actually systemically plan, execute, and democratize the energy transition. So that's about building power within these public bodies, and outside and on the streets, right? And this always needs not compete, but collaborate with those frontline communities, with those cooperatives, with those municipal enterprises. So basically, I think and I think we already made a very good start this morning, like let's move the question away from centralization or decentralization. I think within the energy democracy movement, these have been pitted against each other, and I hope these slides, show that we actually need all these different dimensions. We cannot talk decentralization without a centralized approach to the transition, and we cannot talk centralization without a decentralized approach. So we need both, and democratization should go across all these layers of governance. And so this is about who controls energy, energy for who, energy for what. And as such, of course, we need to, go as deep as to making sure that the energy is used for social purposes, for essential public services, for social reproduction as such. And this means, of course, also putting in place progressive tariffs so that people have the energy based on their need and that people contribute based on their ability. So this core markets principle, this is what should be at the center of who pays what and who gets what, basically. And this is, I think, what energy democracy can take us to if we bring these different scales of decentralization and centralization together. And so in a few months, we'll bring or publish this final piece of our public power dossier, which is the People's Energy Takeover. And it's about kind of seeing how these struggles for decolonization, as is the case in Tunis, but also in South Africa, and in Mexico, actually, is all about democratization and deprivatization. These struggles need to come together. And I will just go a little bit deeper in the Costa Rica example, because it shows actually what a countrywide democratic energy system is capable of. And I'm not saying it's a utopia, it's far from it, but it really has those elements that need to be replicated, not as a blueprint, not as a silver bullet, but let me just go into this, because in Costa Rica, they have been for decades a state-owned energy system with a state-owned utility, ICE, but it's not standing alone. So again, you have a centralized dimension, but it works together. It collaborates with regional, with municipal energy companies, and it works together with 4 huge energy cooperatives that are actually rather democratic. And this is a territory-wide approach. You can call this horizontal integration. So they don't compete. The utility is the backbone, and then retail and some generation is happening locally. And I think what is so interesting about this example is that indigenous frontline communities are holding this state-owned enterprise accountable. They are fighting them on extraction sites, and then they're pushing this utility to become more accountable, to enter into social dialogue, to increase participation mechanisms. And I think it shows us what we can fight for, that it actually works, because Costa Rica has been actually one of the countries that has almost 100% of renewables in its electricity system. And zooming out, actually 9 of the 10 countries that are leading the energy transition, that have most renewables in their electricity mix, have a public system. And then, of course, also community energy, locally, but that goes together. So I will finally conclude here on the land dimension. I think in these spaces, again, we see a big rift between the fight for clean energy, energy democracy, and the fight for land justice. Because renewables take huge amounts of land. I think the plans for renewables in Tunis by transnational corporations has been to the size of Belgium. So the size of Belgium, full of solar panels in Tunisia. So this is something we have to tackle head on. We have to sit together as land, as energy, as environmental justice movements, and work through those tensions and make sure our demands are aligned, that actually we are complementary, right? So for example, in Chile, matter of fact, there's the aim to nationalize lithium. I think this is a big struggle. And also, of course, the fact that there are some communities in north of Chile that are actually saying, okay, lithium, yes, or, like other critical minerals we need for the transition, let's have a look, but we want co-governance. We want to be in charge of our land. And then, of course, yes, it's up to all of us to force that government to actually start sharing power, to transform power, right, in terms of facilitating and defending those frontline communities. So I'll kind of stop here and want to highlight this effort that tried to bring trade unions, the indigenous groups, ecofeminists, environmental justice organizations all together in Chile in 2022. And we built this Energy Democracy Declaration. And to be honest, I'm quite sick of petitions, declarations, manifestos, but I want to say this is something else. It really tries to work through those tensions. It's really a starting point to make sure we have those difficult conversations and we hold on to each other. We support and back each other instead of, you know, like fighting each other as has been happening. So I want to actually ask you on this very moment, if you have your phone with you, please go to energydemocracydeclaration.org. Have a quick look. We want to turn these hundreds of signatures into thousands of signatures to make sure that the COP30 in Brazil, which is a very, very critical moment, I don't need to tell you, to make that the Seattle of climate justice, to make that really the turning point where we are not, you know, bossed around and dictated by these quote-unquote green multinationals. So yeah, that's it. Thanks so much. And I have a number of publications, so please take what you want. And they're online too.